This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Hi, I'm Cyndi Lauper. My scalp was covered with psoriasis, which could lead to psoriatic arthritis. But Cosentyx treats both.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis 300 milligram dose and adults with active psoriatic arthritis 150 milligram dose. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at Cosentyx.com or 1-844-COSENTYX.
Cosentyx works for me.
Ask your doctor about Cosentyx.
Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time Poland swings to the right, again with the election of Karol Nawrocki as president. Nawrocki is a huge fan of Donald Trump. He even flew to the White House during the election to get a thumbs up from his hero in the Oval Office. He represents the Conservative Law and Justice Party, which lost power in the parliamentary elections 18 months ago to Donald Tusk's rather more liberal Civic Platform. Tusk was previously president of the European Council and had pledged to remove political influence from the judiciary and to liberalise Poland's strict abortion laws. Now, though, he could find his legislation vetoed by Nawrocki, who also opposes EU policies on climate change and migration. We're joined by Bartosz Rydlinski. Bartosz is a political scientist based in Warsaw, and Anna Alboth, who is a Polish journalist currently living in Berlin. Bartosz, just give us a little bit of the background here, because I think many people thought that the Law and Justice Party, because they lost in the election to Donald Tusk's Civic Platform, were finished as a political force in Poland. So this marks the resurgence of the right in your country, yeah?
First of all, I think the assumption is wrong because Law and Justice won elections in 2023. They didn't get the self-majority, but they were like the most popular party among Poles. Since parliamentary elections in 2023, they won in local elections and slightly lost in European ones. So the populist right in Poland been and is kind of popular. And I think that yesterday's result of Karol Nawrocki shows that we still have in Poland kind of right-wing hegemony. Karol Nawrocki is going to be a successor of Andrzej Duda from the same political camp. So we're going to have 15 years of ongoing presence of law and justice politicians in the presidential palace. So I think this assumption that law and justice is done was not fair and didn't have, to be honest, rational explanation, because it is still very popular party, especially among those who lost on transition, lost on globalization, and Law and Justice has still very stable electoral base.
So Civic Platform was able to gain power and Donald Tusk was able to become prime minister on the basis of a coalition, but the underlying support for Nawrocki's party remained pretty constant.
Exactly. So even when you see the ecosystem of Law and Justice, you're going to see right-wing televisions, both Telewizja Republika and Telewizja w Polsce 24. They have the newspapers, they have the discussion clubs among right-wing circles, they have kind of support of particular part of the Polish church. So they have kind of existing network which basically strengthened their narrative. Then in terms of social media, they are kind of active, but we must remember that the Nawrocki victory wouldn't be possible without even further far right of Konfederacja. So without 20% of Sławomir Mencen and Grzegorz Braun, two far-right candidates, this success wouldn't be possible. So, of course, law and justice is weakening, but weakening rather to the far right than weakening to the Civic Platform or Social Democrats in Poland.
And Anna, in the UK, we have seen our far-right party, Reform, led by Nigel Farage, winning substantial numbers of seats in our local elections. And then people have seen our Labour Party tacking right in order to fend off the threat of reform. Did Tusk make similar attempts in Poland and adopt the rhetoric of the right, albeit that his party lost the presidential election?
Absolutely. The mainstream parties adopting far-right rhetoric was the ongoing process for the last year. This is something that is worrying me a lot because playing with management of fear that was very much thing of very right-wing government became the mainstream right now. We have many colors of right-wing right now.
Yeah, so Tusk is hardly a left-winger, but the rhetoric then of his party moved to the right to try and combat the opposition. But nevertheless, we see that Nawrocki was elected. So perhaps there's a lesson there for centre-left and left-wing parties elsewhere in Europe.
Yes, and I think that if mainstream politician is leaning to the right to use the right-wing language, it only creates more space for the right side to grow and to overtake the language. I think it actually helped the right wing.
European studies shows every single time when the center-left or center-right parties are trying to steal the far-right language on migration, human rights, they are losing their own supporters. They are not gaining additional for the far-right. Far-right politicians then can go and say, like, look at us. We've been right from the very beginning. So why you should vote for a copy if you can vote for original? So I think this is also the case in Poland. Donald Tusk and Rafał Trzaskowski were using slightly anti-Ukrainian language in terms of social policy, their access to the public health care, labor market, basically showing them as those who are responsible for particular issues, problems with social policies in Poland. And this is not true. Majority of Ukrainians in Poland are working on the full social contracts. They are paying their fair fees for benefits. So they should have access to the healthcare, to the pension system and so on. But because of Nawrocki, Mencen and Braun was using this language, so Tusk had this assumption, okay, so let's compete with those guys on their terms. But apparently it didn't bring the success for the Civic Platform.
I'm intrigued that migration would be such a pressure issue in Poland, because obviously as a member of the European Union, you have freedom of movement. And you'll be aware, I'm sure, that people on the right in the UK were able to mobilise opposition to migration in the UK, not least migration from Poland and other accession states from Eastern Europe during the EU referendum. So what trigger points around migration are used in Poland?
Migration is what you make of it. You can make a lot, you don't have to. You can use it as a political tool, but you don't have to. Different European countries, including Poland, decide to play with the topic of migration. Still, 20 years ago, when Poland hosted 90,000 Chechen refugees, people of different culture and religion, that was not a problem. Today, we are using few thousands of people crossing Polish-Belarusian border as a threat. We all know that this is a political strategy to make somebody be a threat and present yourself as somebody who will protect from this threat. It's working everywhere. Why it shouldn't work in Poland? I believe that fear wins elections, but it destroys solidarity. And this is the biggest problem of what is happening in Poland right now.
So for people in the UK who may not understand this situation in relation to Belarus, obviously we are familiar, sadly, with the situation relating to Ukraine. What is the situation with Belarus and how is that being mobilised to rouse fear?
3.5 years ago, dictator of Belarus, Lukashenko, he opened an additional path to Europe, artificial path. He let people from many different countries come to Minsk on new visas. The visa regime was changed completely. And suddenly on the Polish-Belarusian border, which is the eastern border of European Union, there were a few hundreds of people arriving. Poland decided to frame it as a threat, as a hybrid war with the East, with Lukashenko and altogether with Putin. And we are still in the so-called hybrid war. This is how our government, old government and new government, is describing it. I, as a person covering human rights and being on this border a lot, I have my different opinion on this war because I don't see any war there when cars and trucks are crossing the border with trade. We are not doing anything to change this situation. Maybe this is actually something that fits the narration and helps the government. It's a few hundred people every few months in compared to the amount of Ukrainians who arrived to Poland in 2022. It's nothing. It's not a problem for Poland. But Poland decided to give different answer, to close the borders, to build the fence, to legalize pushbacks, which is, in my opinion, contradiction to security of Poland and Europe.
Of course, both things could be true, couldn't they? That these migrants could be being sent by Belarus and ultimately by Russia in an attempt to destabilize the EU. That could be true at the same time as you're saying that they aren't necessarily a threat to Poland.
It could be, but if we would like to know if they are, we should act according to international law and, for example, check them.
Yeah, exactly. Poland always been a world champ in human rights. We've been well known for being a nation of refugees, but also helping refugees. The current government, the Donald Tusk, by basically suspending asylum human rights, the European Convention, is trying to compete with the authoritarian regime on authoritarian terms. You would never win with Lukashenko on that. Lukashenko will always win because this is an authoritarian dictator. And so using a Finnish example, because Polish Prime Minister said that the Finns done that. Yes, but he forgot that this is the government co-created by the far right. So if the Donald Tusk is referring to the other far-right governments, so good luck with that. This also demotivate many of voters who find human rights as a valid argument for voting for Civic Platform. Right now, many of them who protest against the law and justice illegal pushback, right now they are hearing that the pushbacks are normal example of using power by the Polish state. You don't compete with authoritarian regime. You check them. You open the borders. You check them asylum according by law. Currently, we don't have this rule of law on that particular issue.
I'm finding so many echoes here with the UK. And when you talk about the language of the authoritarian state, certainly the language of the right. And as I say, we have a government which seems keen to echo the language of the right, but is not gaining any evident electoral success as a result of that. The people who like the right think, well, why should we have a light copy of it? Let's vote for the real thing. And people on the, if you like, the traditional left, then feeling demotivated and losing belief in the Labour Party. It's a fascinating echo. Bartosz, tell me a little bit about the language of Nawroscki and his alliance with Donald Trump. I mean, it's quite remarkable that during the election campaign, he actually gets admission to the Oval Office and gets a thumbs up. This kind of right-wing alliance. You've got Orban in Hungary, now Nawroscki in Poland, Nigel Farage here in the UK of Reform is also close to Donald Trump. So this kind of transatlantic populist alliance.
Yeah, this is the far-right international. In the past, the socialists have been good with doing that. Right now, the far-right is doing that. But this access to the Oval Office, this photo op by Trump and Nawroscki shows that there is a close collaboration between law and justice, Peace Party and Republicans. We even call that Karol Nawrocki is a Make America Great Again candidate in these elections. During the ongoing struggle on customs and the potential custom war between and tariffs war between United States and the European Union, Karol Nawrocki is blaming a Polish government. So you can see that he's basically leaning into the Washington Republican perspective than the Polish or European one.
Just so I understand that, Bartosz, you're saying that Trump decides to impose tariffs on the European Union And Nawroscki blames Poland and the EU.
Poland and the Polish government, because right now we have the presidency of the European Council, and Nawrocki said, and there is a kind of logic behind that it was the moment when Poland could play more constructive role in trying to find a consensus between Washington and Brussels. But as a future president of Poland, he should basically took side of Europeans. We have a deficit, like don't be wrong, like our tariffs, the tariffs wouldn't harm Poland because we have a huge deficit with the United States. We buy more things than we sell to the United States. But we are enormously interlinked with the German economy, right? Like we are like a siblings economy. So I think that Nawrocki don't know that, to be honest. He's not well equipped with knowledge politician. He's a historian. But when you see his flyer, when he see his message, he hates Green New Deal. He hates European bureaucracy. He's very skeptical on LGBTQ rights. He loves the money instead of the wire transfers, right? So he liked the cash. This is also like catchy, important topic for the Polish far right. So basically, he using MAGA's argument, but in the Polish version.
It's all very sad to comment on and to see how this populistic language is just taking off. And what I see in Poland, the turnout in yesterday's elections was very high. It really seems like our country is completely divided. We speak different languages. We cannot find agreement on so many different topics. And what worries me a lot is today the reaction also of all the mainstream and left side of the political scene, because I don't see much of the reflection on what happened. Why did it happen? If you analyze the results, which of the candidates won, in which cities or in small villages, what happens, you can see that a lot of Poland feels left behind and not understood. And I think this is the most important to look into, because without this dialogue of two different Polands, we will not find any solutions in the next years. And the fear is growing, the challenges are growing. We don't know where Europe will be in next few years. And not being able to talk with your neighbor is a real problem.
Again, echoes of the EU. People listening to this in the United Kingdom will think of our EU referendum, which was nearly a decade ago now, but the divisions from which still sadly resonate in our country, and differences based on geography, based on class, based on education, based on age, which are still very present, and which I think is what you're describing in this presidential election.
Yeah, exactly. But we must remember that Poland always been divided, because when you see that 1989 first half democratic elections, then 1995 the presidential election between Aleksander Kwaśniewski and Lech Wałęsa, 2007 the beginning of this cleavage between Law and Justice and Civic Platform, Poland always been divided. Like this cleavage is clear. Basically we call this Poland A and Poland B, right? The Poland, of the western part of country, much more developed, and rural Poland B, which lost on transition, lost a lot of industry, people with lesser education, lower, let's say, I don't like this word, cultural capital. The issue is that the current government had 1.5 years to try to approach those people who feel left behind. We don't have one Rust Belt in Poland. Our Rust Belt is almost everywhere. It's every single voivodeship, right? But how you approach those people? By delivering them a good quality public services, or for example, buses or trains. There's plenty of parts of Poland which are communication excluded. You have to pick up your private car, you have to go to your neighbor, you have to call your cousin to pick you up by your private car and go to the doctor. This government for 1.5 years didn't done nothing, zero, nada for them, right? So if you don't approach those people, if you don't try to show them that you care about them, you're losing elections. Politics is not rocket science, it's very simple. So I think that the current government forgot about it.
Anna, tell me about the ability now of Nawroscki to effectively throttle the legislation that Tusk wanted to bring forward, for example, on women's rights and issues around climate change and so on. Are we facing a couple of years of paralysis now in Poland when it comes to introducing more progressive laws?
Yeah, he can block legislation and slow processes, but this is something which is already happening. With President Duda, we had the same situation. I think what a lot of Poland was hoping for was the change, that now, if the other candidate would win, he will not be blocking elections and the legislation, and many things can be changed. We will have more of the same. Let's see how the coalition will survive this election and how will be the discussions between political parties right now.
But how do you feel about the challenge to women's rights, for example, or LGBT rights, climate change? Are we going to see Poland still being a country which is, compared to the rest of Western Europe, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but seen as a more backward country in these regards?
I'm quite sure that yes, because I don't see any power over his decisions that can stop it. I think the hope is really, really low right now.
But we must remember that even with the current government, those bills on women's rights or LGBTQ rights never passed the parliament. So Prime Minister Tusk and his government was afraid that if those bills would go to the presidential office, he would veto that. And it was the justification of not doing nothing. But politics based on emotions, based on symbolism, you have to deliver those bills to the doors of president. If he's going to veto, this is his decision, not the government's. But there is no agreement between the coalition partners from so-called democratic forces on women's rights, for instance, right? We must remember that we have the Polish Peasant, Polish Agrar Party, which is enormously conservative, and they don't want to vote at it. We have the Ministry of Equality, Katarzyna Kotula, and she's been bullied by the members of the parliament from PSL publicly. Prime Minister never took her side, never said that you shouldn't use media saying that there wouldn't be agreement on particular issues on human rights. The members of the parliament from the current coalition, from the Agrar Party, Polish People's Party, said basically nasty homophobic things about gay and lesbians publicly. So why people from LGBTQ community should vote for so-called Trzaskowski if they wouldn't have confirmation or wouldn't be sure that they particular topics valid points would be passed by the parliament?
As we're recording this, Sir Keir Starmer has just announced a defence review in the UK, and he's talked about the UK being put on a readiness for war, effectively on a war footing, and anticipating a potential threat, perhaps not directly to the UK, but perhaps to one of our allies from Russia. Poland has been one of the countries in Europe which has spent most on defence in recent times. How do you regard what Starmer has said, and how fearful are you of Russia, the bear on your doorstep?
I believe that Russia is the real threat, and we shouldn't forget about it. But I think that civic resistance is also a very important topic within any kind of war or any kind of preparation for war. But to have any kind of civic preparation, there has to be discussion on the local level, of the national level. People have to know each other, trust each other, and build society. Of course, we can spend a lot of money on militarization and buying this equipment and that, but neighbors don't talk with each other now. This is the first step, in my opinion.
When you talk about civic resistance, do you mean resistance in the event of invasion, so that people can stand together and perhaps form some kind of guerrilla resistance to an invading force?
Yes, I mean all the forms that are already existing, but also all the informal groups, fire brigades in the villages, teams of scouts, all of these groups, they exist and they are standing in place, but they don't talk with each other. Even border guards with the police and army, they are in fights now because of what is happening on Polish-Belarusian border. First step is some discussion about the real threat.
So you're suggesting that the language of division, which is used by Nawroscki, but which has also now been echoed by Tusk and his party, undermines the potential for that civic resistance?
Absolutely.
Of course, Russia is an essential threat to the Polish independence, but also to the security of the Polish people. Like we've seen bloody Russian policies in Chechnya, we've seen in Georgia, we've seen in Ukraine, we've seen Bucha, Irpin, and so on, right? We've seen that death squad marching and killing Ukrainian people, kidnapping Ukrainian children and moving them into Russia. The Russian Federation is bombing every single day in Ukrainian towns. So yes, we are afraid of Russian Federation. Russian Federation has pure imperialistic policies. I claim that this is also different civilization than the European one. I think this is more like Asian authoritarian regime. So yes, we are afraid. And of course, this plays also a role, like in terms of the decision of Poles during the yesterday's elections, especially that some of the voters are afraid that if Trzaskowski would win, the current government would send Polish troops to Ukraine, which is basically fake news. It was never been used by government, never been used by Trzaskowski, but the far right use this, that if Trzaskowski is going to win, they're going to send troops to Ukraine, for a peacekeeping mission. But as you can see, that the response from the government, from the so-called establishment parties, went very, very weak, because you had to defend yourself in fake news, not showing basically we are a responsible country. And of course, we would like to support Ukraine, but Ukraine is still not a NATO member state. So we were going to help politically. We're going to send weaponry to Ukraine, but we are not going to be involved whatsoever in this conflict.
Great to speak to you both. Thank you to Bartosz Rydlinski and Anna Alboth, and really enjoyed listening to that insight into Polish politics, which has ramifications far beyond the Polish border. Before we go, just to say, if you want to read more about this, don't forget to subscribe to the Byline Times. It's our brilliant monthly news publication, edited by Hardit Matharu. You can head over to bylinetimes.com to find out how to take out a subscription. The Byline Times contains the best of our online articles with content that you can't read anywhere else. And if you take out a subscription, you're also helping this podcast as well. BylinePodcast.com. And don't forget the Byline Festival, which is at Keele University. Just put in bylinefestival.com to find out full details of that as well. This episode of the Byline Podcast has been produced in Birmingham, UK, by me, Adrian Goldberg, and Harvey White. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline.